Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. You're about to listen to our Literature Series 1, Part 2 of For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard, and this is going to be just about Chapter 3. Now, I know in the first one, if you actually watch it, you can check out the YouTube page or on the podcast, which you can go to criticalthinkingisrequired.com or the Facebook page, Critical Thinking is Required, and you can actually look at the first part if that's something you'd like to. And I said, I think in that one that I covered 1 to 3, but I actually covered just Chapter 1 and 2. Actually, the way the book is set up is kind of confusing the way the chapters are, because he has like a part 1, I don't know. And then I have my own part 1, part 2, so I'm kind of causing conflict within myself. But we are going to cover just Chapter 3. It's going to be a short one, and then there's going to be 2 more parts, and then we are done with this book. Some of it I might skip because I just don't really like it or don't really want to talk about it, so just to let you know. And just to remind everyone, if you like this, make sure you check out the other ones, criticalthinkingisrequired.com, and you can learn more about this show and more about For a New Liberty. And if you're listening to this on podcast, it is a video as well, which is just a lecture presentation, which is just PowerPoint presentation. It's as boring as can be, but I provide some pictures in there that hopefully will make it a little bit more fun. And so just to remind everyone again, this book was written by Murray Rothbard, and it was written in 1973. So 40 years ago, this guy was writing about all this stuff, which can equally apply today, which you can either look as a good thing or a bad thing. The cynic in me, although I'm a little optimistic, I suppose, but very pessimistic here, as we'll learn today, it tends to think that, man, it's just history repeating itself, and there's really nothing we can do. But we're going to talk about it. So chapter 3, and he talks about the state. Now, what he writes is the state is the aggressor. So the state, by far, is the supreme and best organized aggressor against the persons and properties of the mass of the public. Right? So let's say we were comparing to GM or McDonald's or Walmart. Those aren't aggressor, even if they were aggressors, let's say they were, they're still not the biggest aggressor because the state is the one that controls all of our lives. Walmart, even if they were an aggressor, let's assume they were, okay? They can only really aggress upon the people who shop there at that store, right? Or they could only aggress the people where they go, right? But the state holds basic control over everyone who lives within the state. And because the state is within the 50 states, of the United States, plus the territories, plus everywhere else we are, it's seen as, much larger in comparison to something like Walmart or GM, assuming that they were aggressors. But in fact, they're not aggressors because when you go to Walmart, you do it voluntarily. You can choose to go to Walmart, you can choose to go to Target, you can choose to go to Myers, or depending wherever you live, north or south, and you can go to all these different places on a voluntary basis. But when you live in the United States, you live in the United States. There's no voluntary reaction. And that's why the state is the biggest aggressor. So you can look at the pictures on the PowerPoint presentation. I have taxes and war and jail. These are other examples of how they act as an aggressor and how it's not really voluntary. So you have to pay taxes. You didn't say you wanted to pay taxes. And I would assume most people would probably, maybe some people would want to pay taxes, but nowhere near as much as you pay now. Maybe 10%, right? Like tithing. That'd be a safer number. Or jails. I mean, that's not voluntary. Whether you commit, even if you were to commit a crime, that's not murder and just theft or something, or even a possession of marijuana or possession of a firearm, you're going to jail. That's not voluntary. And war or mass murder, whatever you want to call it, that's also not voluntary. So let's go with one example that he talks about, and that's taxation. So every person or group receives its income by voluntary payment. So that's the difference between the state and a private entity. Okay, so the private entity or individual people, we all receive our payment, our monies, through voluntary means. Now, the state is a bit contrast because it's not voluntary, it's aggressed and it's forced, it's coerced, right? You have to pay taxes. You live in an area, you have to pay property taxes to support your school, your local public school, your police. Even if you don't have a child that goes to the public school, you still have to pay it. So it's in contrast to a bank or anyone else that lives, any other type of voluntary exchange that you do with someone else, that's voluntary and the state is not. But there's this exception. So you have this rule that everything we do is voluntary unless you're government, and then it's not. So this is an exception that government has created. So only the government obtains its income by coercion and violence. So that's specifically what Murray Rothbard writes, that only government obtains its income by coercion and violence. Now, I actually disagree with that. It's true, I suppose, but when you use that word only, the lawyer in me, or the lawyer wannabe in me, looks at that and says, that's not completely true, right? So, example, what about robbery? What about theft? I mean, or a mob boss or something. If I'm a mob boss, or if I'm just a robber, let's just say, and I take money from a purse from an old lady who's walking down the road, if I take it from her, I've obtained income by coercion and violence. So it's not only government, but it's kind of depressing if you're comparing government to a robber or a theft, because then, in fact, that's what government is sort of doing. The only difference, I suppose, between the government in that instance and the person who robs or steals is that it's only the government who can use the direct threat of confiscation or imprisonment. So they're the only people that can say, oh, well, we're going to fine you, we're going to imprison you, right? The person, well, you can make an argument for a mob boss, let's say. They could but imprisonment's a little iffy, but you could make some argument there, I think. But still, generally, to compare the government to a mob boss or to a robber probably isn't the best thing to do for a government, right? But that's how it acts. And only government can use its funds to commit violence against others. So that's another one I have a problem with. That's not true either. These are quotes. And only, like if you just took that word only out, I would agree completely. But you could have a mob boss again, or you could have, let's say there were no government and we had tribes of some sort or some local police agencies. Well, they could, in fact, start a war. They could use their funds that are used voluntarily, right, by people in that community, and they can then use violence against others. Same if you had insurance companies that acted as the defense industry. You could have the same problem where the funds from voluntary people could be used to commit violence against and coerce others to cause damage and violence upon others. So you do have that problem. But I guess I'm being a little picky. So who protects us from the state? Now, Murray Rothbard talks about a lot of stuff. A lot of this presentation, I kind of condense a lot of things into just a few sentences. But so who protects us from the state? Well, the Constitution, right? That's what protects us from the state. That's what we're supposed to believe. That's what we learn in school all the time, every year that we went to. The Constitution, it's the greatest thing ever invented. You have the Bill of Rights, all this stuff, right? So that's what protects us, right? Well, let's look at the real effect of it. Well, it has to be interpreted by men. So there's human beings, people, just like you and I, or the elite, so maybe not like you and I, that have to, whoever that is, have to interpret this thing called the Constitution. And those people, so not only do they have their own biases, their own opinions, their own self-interest, their own views of the Constitution, you have originalism and it's a living document, all this other problems, right? Well, these people are also employed by the state. So that seems to be kind of an interesting way to look at it if you think about it in the sense that if, let's say it was a private industry, and let's say you went into Walmart and you slipped and fell on a piece of cheese that was on the floor, okay? And let's say Walmart had a court system within Walmart. Well, I'll give it a little credit here. It had a business that was right next to it, or a street away, and it was the court system for Walmart, but it had a Walmart court system. That's what it's called. And they're employed by people at Walmart, and they determine whether Walmart was liable or not. Well, how do you feel about that? So we do the same thing with these people who interpret the Constitution, whether it be the court, the Supreme Court of the United States, or the people who actually make these laws, in the executive branch, who are supposed to interpret the Constitution, although they often don't. But the bottom line is the Supreme Court definitely interprets it, and those people are the ones that determine whether we are protected from the state. And they're employed by the state, so they kind of have a self-interest there, a problem there. Just like everyone does, because that's just the natural state of man, as we discussed in part 1. So are we not the government? So what about us, right? Remember the preamble? We the people. Well, if we are the government, then anything a government does is voluntary. So think about that. This is a good statement, I think he said. It's a good critical thinking part of his book. If we are the government, so you and I and my neighbor and my family, then we're voluntarily, I guess, we're voluntarily granting the state the power, the government the power to do things onto us, right? So if we are the government, then that means they can tax us, they can regulate us, they can require that I have a driver's license, that I register my car and get a license plate, that I pay certain fees, that in some states I have to get an inspection, and I should be okay with that because we are the government, we the people. Well, he writes, and Murray Rothbard makes this good analysis, if so, then the Jews who were murdered by Nazi government were not murdered, right? It was suicide. Because if the Jewish people who lived in Germany at the time, so we're talking about Jewish people in Germany, so not outside of Germany, but inside Germany, if they were killed by the government, or even someone here, another example would be the death penalty. How is that not voluntary then? He's the government, right? We the people are the government, right? We always hear that from progressives. So if we are the government and you do something bad and you face the death penalty, well, nobody's doing anything bad to you. You're doing it to yourself, right? So I don't, it's just interesting. It's an interesting point of view I never thought about. So even if, and this goes so far that even if 90% of the people still decided to murder the other 10%, it's still murder, right? So, and what he's saying there, and this is the other side of it, is that, you know, whatever the government does onto other people, it's still coercion, it's still violence, right? Because we don't all consent to it. And so even if it was 99% of people who said, you know what, we need to kill this 1%. What if the Occupy Wall Street, they said, we're going to kill all the 1%. Well, if they did that, and they did it through the government, that you'd have to think that it's still murder, even though we are the people, but it's still murder, okay? And you could look at it in the sense that the progressive view, which would, again, it would be sort of like the Jewish example, where it would be a suicide, but that's not how it is in real life, in the natural state of man. That's murder. That's what that is. And so he also writes, so what will happen to the state when you have a state is the natural consequence is that it's going to become an oligarchy. So we hear that today, you know, that's a big fancy word that's being used today by newspapers and the media and even by politicians, is that we're having this oligarchy and they're in control. You know, rule of this, how Murray Rothbard defines as a coercive elite, which has managed to gain control of the state. But the problem is that this has been said for a long time. You know, this isn't new. This isn't even new in the 70s and 80s and 60s time frame. This has been happening since either the genesis of this nation or even beyond that. You're always going to have a coercive elite. This is what we were talking about in part one. One of the themes of part one of this show is that we have a ruling class. I mean, that is a fact of government. There's no way around that. Even if you had some sort of communistic type of society, you'd still have to have a leader, and that by itself, even just one leader, although you'd have to have many really, because of the mode of production and the economy itself, there's no way that one person could do that. You'd have a ruling class, right? And so why will it become an oligarchy? Well, you have the nature of state. So we talked about that in part one. The nature of the state is just going to happen. Then you also have this thing of the inequality and division of labor that's inherent in the nature of man. So each individual, you and I, we all differ in our ability and interest. I might be better at podcasting, or maybe I'm not if you're listening to this, than someone who can't speak as well, or I don't know, because maybe I'm not that good, right? But I am interested in it, and maybe someone's not. Maybe they're more interested in designing clothes. Okay, so there's going to be that inequality and that division automatically, and it's just a natural state of man. That's what's going to happen. And so another consequence of that division is you're going to have leadership. And that leadership, not everyone's going to be able to fulfill that. They're not even going to want to do that. And even assuming that they want to be good, doesn't mean they're going to be good at it. And so what's going to happen is that leadership's going to be assumed by a minority that's most able. And that's inherent. You're going to have people who are just a little bit more energetic. They're going to try a little bit harder. Now, of course, I don't think that's a golden rule, because you also have people who are put into positions of authority based on experience. Well, not experience. I'm saying the wrong thing. Based on the length of experience, I'm trying. So the length of time. Like, let's say you've been a police officer for 20 years, so now you can be the chief of police, compared to someone who's been a police officer for 5 years, but they've solved 1,000 murders compared to your one. Well, you have a problem there, right? So it's not a perfect rule, but that's definitely a natural state of man, that's what's going to happen. So then the question is, who makes up this elite? And this is important in part one, who makes up this ruling class? And so you have this full-time apparatus of people who make up this elite. So back in the day, you had kings. So back when you had the church and the state, and the Catholic Church and all that stuff in the Middle Ages, a little bit after that, well, you had the kings who were in charge. The king, the divine right. Remember, we hear all about that. And today you have politicians and you have bureaucrats. You have all these people who operate and man the state. That's who makes up the elite. And these groups, and additionally, so in addition to that, you also have the groups who have maneuvered to gain privileges and benefits from the state. So I just recorded an interview with Dr. Mark Thornton, and that's exactly what he talked about. Is something like this. You can have subsidies for people, but what's going to happen is it's not going to go to everybody. It's just going to go to a few people, and that's the elite. So and that's an interesting point of view, because it's not just the elite, the Eric Holder, the Hillary Clinton. I mean, I'm looking at a picture here. I'm trying to look at the names or look at the pictures of them and trying to do the names. Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Boehner, all these people. It's not just those people, but it's also the people who've gained privileges. Think about the tax credit that you get when you have a child. Well, that is someone who's gained a privilege and benefit from the state that someone who doesn't have a child doesn't get. And that's not right. So in a way, they're sort of the elite, because now they have this control in government to take from some people and give to others, or give to themselves, really. And so then you also have, he writes significantly about the state and intellectuals. And I think he actually has a whole section on this. And so the rest of the show is going to be about that. Well, the intellectuals, okay, these are the mechanism. It's the mechanism for how the compliance and acquiescence of the mass is secured. So that's what he says. So you have the state, but in order to give credibility to the state, you need this group of the intellectuals. So the ruling class by itself, these elite people, it's just not enough. You have to have people that people respect, people want to listen to, and people will follow. And that's what's going to happen. The masses will follow passively the ideas of the intellectuals. And you can see that. Now, I don't know if I would define it as the masses or the political masses, because think about it in the sense that not everybody votes. If only 50% of the people vote, and then 25% are Democrats, 25% are Republicans, well, that's not the mass. I mean, it depends what masses mean, I guess. You can always define that. But it's not everybody. So there's food for thought and some positive, I guess. There's my optimism, I guess, is that it's not everybody. And you can even look at viewership of TV and CNN, how there's just like a few million people, Fox News, a few million people. You have a country that's 320 million. So they're not that powerful, but for some reason they have power and they can somehow influence people to show up and vote. Because you don't need a majority to vote and to win a presidential election. But why? Why would these intellectuals want to take this position? Why would they want to go on TV and share this information? Why would they want to be Krugman? Why would they want to be, I'm trying to think of someone on the right, name's not coming to me, but I'm thinking of another left, like Thomas Pinkay, whatever his name is. But that, right? So why would you want to be these people? Well, there's a quid pro quo. So these intellectuals, they're granted by the state the power, power, status, and material security. So that's what they receive, this power. They have that status too. They're on TV, that you can go to them. Wolf Blitzer, right? You can go to him. He'll know everything. Rachel Maddow is the same way. We can respect her or not, but she has this status over people, and people will listen. Even Jon Stewart, who's on a comedian, and it's a comedy show, yet he can have this power and this status of people. So he'd be considered an intellectual, and he often does support the state, even though his views also often conflict with the state, which is interesting. And so you need these people to plan the economy and society. So there's the important part, is that it's in their self-interest to be an intellectual and support the state and give credence and respect and, to give that to the state, because they need someone to give the plan, to give the ideas. They need someone like Thom Hartmann so he can suggest ideas and say, this is what we need to do. He can write a book saying that we need this. We need the government to intervene here. Huffington, she can say the same thing, right? She can write a book and say, we need to do this, this, and this. And so that's one aspect of how why the intellectual would want to do this and support the state and give credibility. That's the word. That's the word I was thinking about. And if you're looking on the YouTube, I have a picture of the 5, which is probably the worst. You think about the worst political show on TV, and you immediately got to think of Fox News, right? And the 5 is by far the worst. It makes no sense. Any clip you find on YouTube, I don't have cable, so I just watch YouTube. Any clip you can find on YouTube with the 5, you will laugh. Like, it's guaranteed to either make you laugh or so pissed off that you're going to break the screen. But generally, I laugh because I'm an optimist, right? So the state and intellectuals, we'll keep going. So how do they use this power? Well, or how do they get this power? Or how do they give the credibility to the government? Well, there's a lot of ways, and one of them is through tradition and habit. So if you have this tradition, let's say, let's give an example of I pledge allegiance, right? So you go to school, you're indoctrinated from a young age, and you keep doing it until you're high school. You start in the beginning of the school day, you put your hand on your heart, you pledge allegiance, you say the whole thing, right? Well, that provides legitimacy. Think about it. You keep doing that every day. You're looking at the flag, and you're doing this thing that everyone else is doing. It provides legitimacy to this rule under which people live. Then the other ways is they deprecate the individual. So what you want to do is what the government wants to do in order to have this power, and that's what we're talking about right now, is they want to put down, deprecate's kind of a big word. They want to lower the status of the individual, and they want to instead exalt the society. So we talked about this in part 1. Society, it's a set of people. It's really nothing. It's not a tangible thing you can look at. I can't even look at society. It's an idea. And that's what the government would want you to do. They want to say, we need to help poor people, not that we need to help people or that we need to help individuals. We need to help this individual person because he has a hard time. So think about it in your own community. Usually you feel better to help someone that their specific situation than you do a lot of people. But what the government wants to do is they want you to exalt that whole group. And you can read articles after articles from these intellectuals, right, who use their means of production to spread the message that we need to just help poor people, whatever the heck that is. And so but the interesting part of that is that any new idea must begin as a minority opinion. So regardless of whether, we need to look at society as this big mass of people or this large group like poor people or something like that, or black people or white people, whatever, regardless of any view that is made by government, every idea is going to have to start from a minority opinion. It starts from one person, and then a couple other people jump on it, and then others. So what's interesting about that, and why I'm adding that, is that every idea starts with one person. And so why are we deprecating the individual? We should be exalting the individual because they're the ones who start this opinion. And it becomes a majority opinion. It becomes something good, something big. And so they make the rule seem inevitable. And I can, this is one of the reasons that I'm sort of pessimistic, I guess, on the outlook of government and its people and just society in general, is because maybe I fall for this, whether it's true or not. I can look at history and kind of provide some sort of, credibility to this argument, but it makes the rule seem inevitable. There's nothing that anyone can do about it. We can look time and time again that people will fight for something. Maybe they'll die. The American Revolution, right? These are the people fighting for their freedom, for life, liberty, and happiness, and it still goes right back to the way it was, and it's even worse, right? So that's one way it does it. So, the way you look at it is that, you're looking at the situation, you go, you know what? There's nothing I can do. I can't get rid of government, so I'm just going to have to vote Republican because I support them more than the other side, or the other way around. So other ways, well, they also use fear. Now, this is a huge one, right? We can see this today in Ferguson. I'm recording this during the whole incident in Ferguson, where they use fear. And so they can either use, and then they break it down to this us versus them mentality that I've discussed time and time again, whether it deals with race or whether it deals with security or economic prosperity, whatever it is, or terrorism, whatever it is, it's an us versus them. And it's so powerful on that emotional level where it gets you to go, you know what? I'm on my side. I believe in this state. We are going to fight this other thing. We're going to eradicate it. And it even does it in some instances of, let's say, let's say we're going to go to space. it's sort of an us versus them mentality too. So it's just kind of thing. But he wrote more about the man's natural love of homeland. Right? So we have a natural love of where we live, and the identification of that land is a means of making natural patriotism work. Okay? So we, for some reason, and you can see this in football games that you go to, you can go to a football game and, in your local town, and or let's say, I'm thinking college level too, because I remember back in my days. So I'd go to my MSU game, right? And then, because that's where I lived, because I was going to Michigan State for a while. And so if we're playing Michigan, let's say, and Michigan fans are there as well, it creates this sort of us versus them mentality, because it's sort of like this natural thing where for some reason you have a love of homeland. And so you kind of want to fight the other. You're either going to cuss at them or yell at them. Maybe it's just play initially. But through government, it's often violent. So we can do us versus them on the war on terrorism, and we can think about Iraq and us, or Iran and us, or ISIS and us. Or, the list could go on and on. Another thing is guilt. So they use this power of guilt. Well, they kind of put it in this sense that any increase in your private well-being, it's greed. You don't want to have that. Okay? You don't want to increase. You don't want to become more rich. That's not a good thing. That's greedy. You want to stay how you are, maybe get a little better incrementally, but you don't want to make a whole lot of more money, because that's just greedy. And that's not right. We can't have that. So you should feel guilty, and that will give credibility to the state, because you're going to look to the state, right? And so mutually beneficial exchanges, or voluntary, exchange, well, that's selfish. You can't have that. And so think about it too. Think about it in the sense, and this is how powerful this really is. So you think about it and go, maybe that doesn't really happen. But think about this, okay? When Walmart or Apple is treated differently sometimes. Let's say who's not really liked. Walmart, I guess, or an oil company. Let's say an oil company, okay? So they make a lot of money, a lot of profits, and they use it to expand. And they get bigger and bigger, and they increase production, but nobody really looks at that. What they look at is that they're making more money, and maybe they're avoiding taxes, or they're making more profits. And what happens? Well, an increase in private well-being equals greed. And so they're going to think, people are going to go, oh, there's this greedy company. But does a state ever get called greedy? So, our deficit right now is over $18 trillion. It's getting bigger and bigger. It's been doing that since day one, right? And nobody calls the state greedy, except the libertarians, of course. But it's not called greedy. Why does it get this exception? Well, it's through guilt. That's how it is. So another way is the use of scientific jargon. And what this does, all these fancy words that are used by scientists, or social scientists, or pseudoscientists, whatever you want to call them, well, they permit the intellectuals to create excuses for the state. So Murray Rothbard gave an example of the multiplier effect, which is part of, I think, Keynesian economics, which is sort of like if we continue to spend more, that will create jobs, because those people will spend more, and those people will spend more, and those people will spend more, right? But if you think about, and he gave a good example here. So let's pretend you had a thief. And let's pretend the thief, okay, let me point this out real fast. So you have this multiplier effect, and the reason you have that is because you're justifying it by saying that it's going to help other people, okay? So you can spend more and spend more and spend more because it's going to help more people, right? Just like I'm going over. So let's say you had the thief, and the same thing with a thief. You have one thief, he goes out, and he steals money from his neighbor, and he takes all the money, and then he gives it to other people, and then those other people spend it. Well, couldn't the thief then say that, I can justify my theft because what I'm doing is I'm helping people. I'm helping the victims too. I'm helping the people I'm taking the money from because I'm spending. Because now I'm taking $100 from him, okay, and I'm going to give $50 to his neighbor and another $50 to the other. Well, they're going to go spend it, and then that's going to get spent, and eventually it's going to get spent maybe where this guy works at, the neighbor where you stole the money from. And so isn't that helping? No. You can't make that argument, right? That wouldn't work in a court, but the government can. They can make that argument. They can do that, and it's called the multiplier effect, and that's what intellectuals use to create that excuse. And so if you look on the PowerPoint presentation, I give the supply and demand and the Keynesian economics type of argument here, and it's supply side. This is just horrible. Like, how do you understand something like this? And this is the Keynesian multiplier effect. So I'm actually giving the diagram for the multiplier effect. And it's just really complicated. And And so he also writes about the libertarian creed. And this is sort of a review of the first part. And this is the bottom line. You can take this in. And that the absolute right of every man to the ownership of his own body. So every man should have the right to his own body. Okay? And the absolute right to own and control the material resources the man has found and transformed. That homesteading. Remember, we learned that homesteader, that key word. So you own the right to your body. You own the right and the absolute right. Nobody else can tell you what to do. You own the right to your body. You own the right to, go outside in a public area that's, not anybody else's land. Take something and turn it into something else. And then you also have that absolute right to exchange or give away the ownership to such titles. So that thing you homesteaded, you can now give it away or you can exchange it for something else. That's the libertarian creed. And that basically sums up part 1 and part 2. So the themes of part 2 that we discussed today, there are 3 main themes. And the first is that the state is the biggest aggressor. So, you really can't avoid that. You really can't avoid that argument because of like the Walmart example that I gave, even assuming that Walmart wasn't voluntary, because we have a difference there. So I'm making the progressive argument that maybe the state is voluntary through the voting and maybe by living here, let's say, which you may not agree with. But even then, it's still the biggest because it can do things that no company could do or could even do, okay? And then the other theme is that the Constitution, it's not defined by some third party, which would be an interesting idea to see how that would work out, although you'd have problems in itself by that. But it's not defined by someone else or by other people or other groups of people. It's defined by the state. And interestingly enough, that's one of the reasons why the founders or whatever at the time wanted to have jury by trial, is because they wanted to avoid the state. But in fact, it's kind of gone. That has been thrown out the window. And then the last theme was that intellectuals are used to further the state. So we have these people who get these fancy degrees, who we, for some reason, look up to, regardless of what their true opinion is, or what the realistic facts and consequences of whatever that person is saying, and we listen to them. And maybe not us specifically, but the mass and the general people, right? And so that's today's episode and today's literature series, and thank you for listening. Make sure you check out criticalthinkingisrequired.com, and you can learn more, and you can see more of these literature series that we will continue to have, as well as our episodes and interviews and all that fun stuff. But thank you for listening, and as always, think critically.